Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. This episode is featuring a panther on my lap. Look, Poncho. So we're going to be continuing our discussion about Dead Like Me. We are finally in season 2 and we're going to be talking about episode 1 of season 2. This episode is called Send in the Clowns and it's a double entendre for one, Mason is the clown that is being sent in at one part of this episode. On the flip, this is also a phrase that you say when crowds are kind of getting restless. Send out the clown. You know, go entertain them. This episode is huge. There's so much to cover and we're gonna try to get through it as quickly as possible. First off, Georgia admits to reading the obituaries that this is like a Grim Reaper sports cover page. You know, it's that important thing that they all have to do first thing in the morning is figure out who died throughout the week. It's something that gets them excited. George and Daisy talk about death and sex and how George never had sex or she never did anything with a boy when she was still alive, and this is foreshadowing to something that happens in this episode, but also it's foreshadowing to something that's going to happen way later in the season with Trip. Mason confesses that he is off the booze, and later it talks about how he's been off booze for about 3 weeks now, so he's clean and sober. They get a group reap, so it's Daisy, Mason, and George. They have to go to this farmer's market where there's an explosion and this gas leak happens, 5 people die. So George's reap that she gets is this woman, her name is Deirdre, and she gives her a little tap, and then the explosion happens, and it reminds George of her death. To make matters even worse, before Deirdre died, she gave George a pink lily as a symbol of her first customer of the day, and this made George feel so guilty because she took something from this woman and then killed her, basically. So George feels really sad, and the bodies everywhere remind her of her death because her death ended in an explosion, and this is the first time that she's seen a death like this, and it takes her right back. This episode addresses very subtly the idea of PTSD, so it's kind of always tackled the idea of grief and the 5 stages of it, and in this episode, George later talks about how she has kind of gone through her whole life doing things and feeling bad and then feeling good. She kind of talked very similarly in the episode where she met Charlotte about how college is all about like binging, feeling good, and then feeling bad. So this is something that George has echoed in the past, but in this episode, she feels really bad about this death and she kind of spends the rest of the episode trying to feel good about something. But this could also be a result of PTSD and the trauma that she has not processed through in her death, and we're going to see that in the next episode. In this particular one, she clearly has not processed through it. She hasn't even really addressed it, and it's coming back and it's hitting her full force. We'll kind of just take each character one by one from the starting point. So I'm going to continue with George. So George goes back to their Waffle House and she has this interaction with Daisy. She tries to order her breakfast, and while she's ordering her breakfast, she's talking about the body and the scene of the explosion, and Tiffany is there taking her order, and Tiffany just seems really unfazed, which kind of taps into this theory that I have that Tiffany might be a friend of the Reapers, or she's in on what they're doing but just doesn't actively talk about it, because she didn't really seem very fazed when they were doing their self-examinations. She didn't really seem fazed when the Gravelings were taking a holiday and were kind of doing weird things around their Waffle House. Tiffany just generally seems very unbothered by the Reapers, and in this, where George is literally talking about how this woman's brains were everywhere, Tiffany doesn't even really react. So Georgia goes back to Happy Time and she finds out that she's gonna have to be training this boy named Brennan, and she initially thinks that Brennan is really cute and taps into this conversation that she had earlier with Daisy about never doing anything with a boy, and it starts releasing these almost animalistic feelings that she has in her to just rip into this guy. I personally didn't think he was as attractive as she made him out to be, but that's beyond the point. She and this guy kiss in the office. This is her second post-death kiss, and now she's having all these feelings and she's feeling good, but then she's also feeling bad and she's wondering, why does she like this guy so much? And she kind of has this moment where she's like, I think it's just because of my death, and I keep thinking about that pink flower and thinking about this betrayal of this woman, and you know, I betrayed somebody, and maybe that's what I'm just trying to do. I'm just trying to feel good about what happened earlier today. And this is almost bargaining if you look at grief in those 5 stages. So, you know, things progress with Brennan in the office. Millie has a conversation with Dolores, and Dolores mentions about how office romances never really go well. And she mentions this guy named Julio, who apparently cleans out the trash. And we're going to hear about Julio later on in the season. So this is a funny jumping point for an ongoing character that we don't see very much of, but we hear a lot about. So then Dolores catches Millie and Brennan making out, and she ends up giving George a promotion to take her off of Brennan, so to speak. And it kind of speaks to this jealousy that Dolores has, and we saw that in the last episode, is that when Dolores is mad at Millie, she takes it out on her through her work. And when Dolores is happy, that she gives her good things. And this kind of plays into both of those. Dolores is jealous of her relationship with Brennan, so she decides to give Millie a promotion because she wants Millie kind of to herself. So Rube tries to convince George not to take the promotion. He tries to convince her that she should just keep doing what she's doing and she should stay young, and he calls her Peanut and she says, "Don't call me that." And this is a parallel to the very last episode of this season where he calls her Peanut and George says, "Don't call me that, I'm not that girl," and then he calls her Peanut again. So this is, we're starting to get into these points where the episodes are paralleling each other, the first and the last episode of this season, and it's really nice because it bookends really, really, really well. And then George ends up going to the graveyard and leaves the Lily at her grave, and she realizes that the person she betrayed was herself and her family, and she's starting to process through this trauma. She is just at the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. She's not quite there yet, but she's addressing it, and that's what's important. So let's flip to Daisy, because Daisy has a really huge story arc throughout this one. So Daisy, in the beginning of the episode, she's cheery, she's feeling good, she goes to the Reap, and then she starts feeling like fine. She gets to their Waffle House, and Roxy comments about how she looks like a dog, and that puts her in this really weird headspace. So later on in the afternoon, she confronts Roxy and asks her, "Why did you say I looked like a dog?" And she confesses that she had a bad dream that night, and it made her feel really sad, and it put her in a weird headspace, that she was on the set of Gone with the Wind, and she was about to meet her idol, and everything went really well. That made her really sad because it didn't actually happen. She died before she got to meet her, so it put her in a weird headspace. And so Daisy is feeling sad about things, again, echoing that feeling sad and then feeling better. So then when she finishes her Reap, this woman has this really expensive looking cross on her neck. Ends up falling off when she gets crushed by a trash can that's coming down off of one of the garbage trucks. And Daisy ends up taking the cross from the ground and she wears it. She gets the blood out with just a little soap and water, and everything's good. And at the very end of the episode, she confronts George and asks her why she's so angry and apologizes to her for George dying so early and so young and not getting to do the things that she wanted to do. But basically tells her, like, she spent her entire life after her death thinking about all the things that she didn't do and all the things that she did do. And this plays into that conversation that George had with Rube about how there's something that Daisy is sad about, and we're starting to see that again. So now let's flip to Mason. So after the explosion, Mason goes back to their Waffle House. He kind of harasses Roxy a little bit, and then he and Rube go to a Reap together at this child's birthday party. So while they're there, Mason he's volunteered by Rube to be the clown, and he's gonna get some money, and he's gonna entertain the family and the kids that are at this party. And he's doing awful things. He's being rude to all the guests. He's making inappropriate comments about people. He's making penis balloons, and he's just generally being really unfriendly and unpolite, and he's just being awful, terrible. And when he completes his Reap, it ends up being the dad of the child who was having her birthday party, and Mason feels so bad about what he did that he tries to make himself feel better by relapsing. And he goes and he finds this homeless person along the street, and he takes their bottle of booze and downs the whole thing while the person's asleep, and then wanders off. So Mason broke his sobriety to feel better about the thing that he did, because Mason knew the entire time that this guy was gonna die, and he didn't do anything to try to make it better. And normally Mason is very, very, very good about trying to make the person who died feel better, or at least he tries. There's always an attempt. Even if he doesn't do it very well, he tries. And in this one, he didn't try at all. So I think he felt bad about that. So then, rewinding just a little bit to Rube, who had some great one-liner, pun type commentary throughout this episode. When Mason is harassing Roxy, Mason is talking about literally small potatoes, and small potatoes as in a metaphor, like it's not that big of a deal. And Mason doesn't get it, so Rube just says, forget about it. And then at the kid's birthday party, he mentions to the wife that Mason has been off booze for a couple weeks, and it's just been seltzer water. And he makes a comment, that much seltzer water would make any clown angry. It's playing in two different types of conversations. One just about the irony of a clown drinking seltzer water when clowns normally get sprayed with seltzer water, and the reality that Mason has just been drinking seltzer water. He has these great moments, but then there's a point where he's talking to the little girl whose birthday it is. She asks him why he's there if he's not the clown's dad, and asks him where his child is, and Rube says, I am somebody's daddy, they're just not at this party. And we see throughout the entire first season that Rube is really protective of George. She's the only one who gets a pet name from him. It's implied very heavily that Rube sees George as a daughter, and the way that he treats her, he sees her as a daughter. And we see that later on near the end of the season after Always, that he really is just very attached to this little girl that he never really got to know because he died before he could be a part of her life. And I think with knowing that the dad was gonna die and this little girl, that put him in a weird headspace. That made him feel bad. So the thing he tried to do to feel better was to parent George and to try to convince her not to take the promotion in Happy Time so that she can kind of just continue being young. And he gets rejected, and I think that makes him feel worse. So now let's rewind all the way to the top of the episode and let's go back to Roxy. So she is at her station getting the orders for the day for the meter maids, and her boss basically tells everybody there have been a lot of complaints from the city about the meter maids, and that one of them pulled out a firearm. And her coworkers know that it was Roxy. Probably everybody knows that it was Roxy, but she wasn't directly called out. It was just roll called to everybody. And they were basically told, you need to be nice and shape up and stop being awful to the people. So Roxy is, she gets mouthed off too, and she doesn't react. Daisy comments on that. And then she ends up taking her anger out on this random punk who's running by, clotheslines him. And then when the cops come to investigate the body of Daisy's Reap, Roxy jumps in and is like, oh, the perp went this way, this is what happened, da 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 da. And the police officer tells her, you've got the wrong job, you should be doing something else. So then when she goes to the Dare Waffle House at the end of the episode, she's reading through a book, and it's because she enrolled in the police academy and she's gonna try to become a cop. This is a perfect job for her. This is the first episode where we see the coffee is free for cops, which again parallels with the final episode when Daisy gets the free coffee from Tiffany. So she gets a free cup of coffee, and Daisy's like, I don't care for this idea of you being a cop. This is not cool with me. And we're gonna continue to see Roxy just being a badass through the rest of the season. And she's always been that, but now she's really jumping off the diving board, so to speak. So let's talk about the B cast now, which is the last family. There's still a lot of conflict between Reggie and Joy. You can tell that Reggie's starting to grow up. She's taking on habits of things that George used to do, and she just is kind of living in her own world, very much like what George used to do. Joy and Clancy are going to therapy. They have a really terrible therapist, like the worst possible therapist that you could have, they got. They decide that they're gonna get a divorce, that they're done. They're not gonna keep playing this game. So they tell everything to Reggie, and in the process of telling Reggie that they don't want to be together anymore, they get into a fight, and Clancy ends up yelling at Joy, saying that she's the reason why everybody leaves, that she's the fault of why George is dead, that she wanted her out of the house and now she's gone, and that blows up even more. And it reflects on Clancy's character, that he pushed George away, so to speak. I mean, she pushed him away, but then he pushed right back, and he didn't try to do anything to mend the relationship. And he feels bad about that, so what he did to try to make himself feel better is to blame Joy and start his affairs. And the way that Joy made herself feel better for what Clancy did to make her feel bad was to continue to push everybody away, like, the world hurt me, so I'm gonna continue hurting the world. So in this episode, we've had so many examples of what George talked about, feeling bad, then feeling good, and we see how each one of these characters takes that idea and puts their own little spin on it. So the episode ends with a parallel to the final episode, which is George leaving a flower at her grave and running through the graveyard and deciding that she's just gonna fly and that she's not gonna be held down by these feelings anymore. So it's a really cool, powerful way to end this episode, and I think overall this is a really great start to the first episode of the season. However, because there's so much content in it, it feels really long, but I think it's worth it. I think it's worth the feeling of the length. So I've got a couple favorite quotes from this episode. In the beginning of the episode, Rube is talking about this Greek god to Mason and to Roxy, and Mason has no idea who it is. So Rube says, he's the Greek god of why don't you read a book. Quote number 2, when Roxy and Daisy are talking, Daisy says, you can't mouth off to people anymore. You're like a bird without a song, a really mean bird. Quote number 3, after Millie gets a promotion, there are some ladies that are gossiping about her in the corner and talking about how much they dislike her. And she walks up to them and says, now that I've got a promotion, I think you should know that I take my coffee with a little milk, 2 sugars, and a whole lot less of your bulk, and then walks away and doesn't even turn around to see the explosion. And my final quote from this episode that I actually use quite frequently is when George is talking to Rube about not taking the promotion and how she's gonna do it. She tells Rube, well, after this little powwow, I think I'm just gonna do what I'm going to do. George is always very headstrong. She's always just gonna do what she wants, regardless of what anybody else wants for her. And it's a great quote for George, but it's also just really practical. So overall, this episode is fantastic. Really, really great way to start off this season. And I'm very excited to start talking about season 2, because I think after doing all of season 1 and editing and filming and everything, I think I've realized what I like talking about is not just what happened in the episode, but what I think is kind of circling around it and what it all means. So I'm excited to talk a lot more about this season now that I've kind of got an idea of how I want to tackle each one of these episodes. So thank you so much for watching. I know this was a long one. Thanks for sticking with me. I'll try to keep the rest of them a little bit shorter, but I'll see you guys next time. Bye.